So we may start. Good evening, everyone, to the third lecture of MindSpheres, hosted by Jadavpur University of International Relations (JAIR). We are delighted to host Dr. Sachin N. Pardhe, Assistant Professor and Coordinator of the Postgraduate Diploma in International Studies at the Department of Civics and Politics, University of Mumbai. Today's lecture is on the topic Strategic Trajectories, Key Determinants, and Principles of Indian Foreign Policy. Dr. Sachin N. Pardhe is an assistant professor and coordinator of postgraduate diploma in international studies in the Department of Civics and Politics, University of Mumbai. His areas of interest are security studies, borders international relations, as well as theories of international relations. He has participated in a US exchange program supported by the US State Department on the study of the US Institute SUSI for Scholars on US National Security Policymaking program in 2012 at the United States of America. He has presented papers in more than 33 national and international seminars and conferences. His recent publications include an article titled Conflicts, Cooperation and Territoriality: Understanding Borders and Security at the Regional Level, and an edited book, Reimagining Border Studies in South Asia, published by Roulette, London, New York in 2021. An article titled The Geoeconomics, the Geopolitics, and the Complexities Between India and China Relations, a Theoretical Perspective in an edited book, Tailspin, The Politics of India-China Economic Relations, published by Roulette, Oxford and New York in 2012, and an article titled India's Role in the Indo-Pacific: Relocating Priorities in the 21st Century in Geopolitics, published in the IUP Journal of International Relations, Volume 18, Number 1, 2024. Sir, we're delighted to have you here, and you may start when ready.
Okay, thank you, Soham. I hope I'm audible.
You are, sir.
Yes. So, first of all, let me thank the entire team, JIR and Atindra in particular, for giving me this opportunity to deliver this talk. And I'm also grateful to the entire JIR team uh, for all of these initiatives, and in fact, reinvigorating the academic spirit of JIR and the various activities that all of you have been contributing to, be it MindSphere talks or webinars, internships, etc. So, first of all, let me thank you for all of that. My association with JIR has helped me a lot in such kinds of interactions, and I truly appreciate all your efforts. So when I was approached to talk on Indian foreign policy, I was thinking about it, and then I gave it a thought, and I framed the title of my topic, which is very much there, that strategic trajectories, key determinants, and principles of Indian foreign policy. But then the moment I started working on it, I did realize that it's a huge topic. And given the time limit, say 40-45 minutes, it will be very difficult to cover the entire domain of the title that I had given initially. So what I thought is that I'll just try to focus on the key aspects, which rather will give sort of a conceptual and some sort of theoretical understanding of how we understand foreign policy, and should provide you some sort of a template that when we analyze the foreign policy of a country, so what is it that we need to look at, or what are the factors that play a crucial role in shaping the foreign policy of a country in general, and how do we look at it in that particular context when we try to understand the foreign policy of India. So let me first try to share my screen so that I could show the presentation. This always is an issue, which I hope it is.
Yes, sir. We can see the screen.
Okay, now I am sharing the screen. Please let me know if you can see the PowerPoint presentation. Is it visible to you?
Yes, sir.
Can you
Yes,
see
sir.
the
It is
PPT?
visible. Yes, sir.
Okay. Just give me a second. Um, so can you see it in full screen mode?
No,
No,
sir.
sir.
Okay, you can't see it in a full screen mode.
So you have to share, if I mean you have to select entire screen option.
Um, okay, just give me a second. But now can you
Now it,
see it?
Yes, sir.
yes.
Okay, is there any issue with the, because I was getting a completely different message.
No, sir. It is
Okay,
visible.
it's visible. Okay, thank you. Okay, so at the very beginning, uh, uh, let me just talk about the title itself. So initially, when I was approached and when I thought about discussing something about Indian foreign policy, that time I had proposed a title which read that particular time strategic trajectories, key determinants and principles of Indian foreign policy. But then I'm taking a liberty of making a slight change in terms of slightly shifting the focus of the presentation so that we could just try to understand the broader framework and not going into the details of specific issues as such. So in that sense, when we try to understand this particular theme, what I am intending to do is to not essentially evaluating foreign policy of India in detail as such, but trying to provide some sort of a context and the factors that have been impacting the foreign policy making or the overall foreign policy of India. So at the very beginning, let me just try to make sense of the title. So when we read the title, it's about strategic trajectories, but then it differs than the term what we generally use in the context of foreign policy is what is called a strategic culture. So it doesn't essentially talk about the strategic culture as such. In fact, it is more or less trying to look at sort of a path that a particular foreign policy of a particular country embarks on. Secondly, when we talk about the term strategic, it actually describes something that is done as a part of a long-term plan to achieve some sort of objective or a goal. And when we combine both the terms, strategic trajectory and uh, 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 strategic trajectory in the context of foreign policy, then we are actually referring to a systematically carved out course of action as a response to the existing realities of the time. Now, there are two things that I'm referring to. First thing is we are talking about systematically carved out course of action. That is something which is very much reflected in what we call foreign policy of a country. And second part, which talks about the response to the existing realities of the time, that actually talks about the context in which a foreign policy of a country is shaped. But context is not the only thing that always play a role in defining the foreign policy of a country. And then we talk about the determinants. So there are certain determinants that are very crucial in shaping the foreign policy of any country. And then there's something called as principles. So in general, when we are thinking about the principles, we are talking about a sort of a philosophical foundation of the foreign policy of any country. So in that particular context, now if we try to understand what the presentation actually intends to do, the presentation intends to discuss the evolution of Indian foreign policy by emphasizing the role of the key determinants in shaping its trajectories. And this is the broad outline of the presentation, and this is how I'm intending to discuss this particular topic. So quickly, I'll give you a very brief introduction about the topic, and then we are looking at the determinants and the principles, and then we'll try to understand the trajectory, and then there'll be concluding remarks in the context, in the sense that how we are anticipating or how we are looking at the contemporary world and how India needs to or should respond to the contemporary challenges. So Indian strategic trajectory can be seen as the culmination of its responses to existing realities and its efforts to ensure the protection of its national interests. And in this particular context, we are trying to understand how Indian policymakers responded to various contexts that when we look at the Cold War period, when we think about the post-Cold War period, or even later on when we think about the contemporary period. So before we try to understand the key determinants and the principles of Indian foreign policy, let us begin with the basics. And if you try to understand the foreign policy in general of any country, there's a lot of literature available and number of definitions in terms of defining foreign policy from multiple perspectives. So there are various ways in which foreign policy can be defined, but one of the definitions that I'm trying to use, or rather the entire presentation revolves around, is the one that I am borrowing from Professor Muni, and who defines foreign policy as it's a policy of a state, is the manifestation of its interest, aspirations, anxieties, and assets, including capabilities and constraints at the international terrain. Now, apparently, it's a very simple and straightforward definition of foreign policy, but at the same time, it's a very powerful definition as well. Why it's powerful is simply because it talks about what exactly foreign policy means, but it also gives us an idea about the critical elements that constitute what we call foreign policy. Now, why foreign policy is important and why do we need to study foreign policy? To understand the significance of foreign policy, let me quote the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. So what Nehru has to say about foreign policy, what Nehru said about foreign policy is that what does independence consist of? It consists fundamentally and basically of foreign relations. That is the test of independence. All else is local autonomy. Once foreign relations go out of your hands into the change of somebody else, to that extent and in that measure, you are not independent. So if you read it carefully and if you try to understand how Nehru was looking at foreign policy, what Nehru was trying to do is to almost equate it with the concept of independence. So in that sense, we can understand how foreign policy is crucial for any country. Then if we try to understand the key characteristics of foreign policy, and these are the general characteristics of foreign policy. For example, when we think about foreign policy in general, foreign policy can be seen as the culmination of multiple factors. So there's not a single factor which contribute to the making of the foreign policy of any country. So there are lots of factors that contribute to the shaping of the foreign policy of any country. Second important thing about foreign policy, or one of the important characteristics of foreign policy, is that foreign policy is a dynamic process and it evolves over a period of time. In fact, the way it tries to respond to the changing circumstances, and as a consequence, it also keeps on evolving. So it's a dynamic process. But interestingly, although we say that foreign policy is something which can be seen as a dynamic process, there's an element of consistency as well. So simultaneously, when we are talking about the characteristics of foreign policy, we need to talk about both consistency and change. So more specifically, when we are referring to the consistency of a foreign policy, the consistency part more specifically is related to the philosophical foundation of a foreign policy. So when we are talking about the principles of foreign policy, that is something which in a way try to provide some sort of continuity and consistency to the foreign policy of any country. And India obviously is not an exception to uh, to this particular thing. Now, let me quickly try to discuss the key determinants of foreign policy, and these actually are the general determinants of foreign policy. And we are not specifically talking about Indian foreign policy. So, as I mentioned previously, when we are trying to understand foreign policy, so we need to understand the factors that impact, that play a very crucial role in shaping, impacting foreign policy. So broadly, what I tried to do is to divide the determinants of foreign policy in four parts. First factor can be called as internal factor, where we are specifically looking at the history and culture of a country. Second factor can be seen in the form of values and principles that the country cherishes. Third is political system and ideology. These are all internal factors. And if we try to look at it more specifically in the context of India, for example, so when we look at the history of India, what is it that we can relate to the historical context when we think about the foreign policy of India? Look at the civilizational legacy that India has. Look at the colonial impact, colonial legacy, or colonial experiences that have hugely impacted, more specifically, the initial phase of foreign policy. When we think about the culture, inclusivity, um, uh, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, a concept which is being talked a lot in present times as well. Besides tolerance, non-violence, these are all the principles and values that that are the part of the trajectory that India has covered so far, and when we look back in the history. So history and culture plays a very important role. In fact, it's something which is very crucial in defining the philosophical foundation of the foreign policy of any country. Besides that, when we think about the political system is one of the key determinants in terms of defining the foreign policy. For example, when we look at India, immediately after getting independence, India opted for democratization, and democracy survived and succeeded in India. And that factor has been very crucial in terms of defining India's relations, not only with its neighbor, but also with the rest of the world. So political system in that sense plays a very crucial role when we think about it as a key determinant of foreign policy. Then there are certain external factors. Now, when we are looking at external factors as key determinants, then we can broadly divide these external factors into two broad categories. One, we can think about the immediate neighborhood of a country, or let us say regional politics. Um, and more specifically, when we are using term regional politics, we can think about the existing balance of power situation in a given region, and what exactly is the position of a country or host country. So your neighborhood plays a very important role in defining the foreign policy. So if you look at post-colonial South Asia, or more specifically post 1947, you can see it's a completely different political landscape that India was exposed to after getting independence. Because there's a term which was very popular and which was widely used until 1950s, and it's the Indian subcontinent. But the moment we enter into the post-colonial era, you'll see that the term Indian subcontinent was being replaced with a new term called South Asia. So the very use of South Asia in the context of this particular region gives us an idea about the changing political landscape and the emergence of new political entities in the subcontinent. And when you look at the very process of the emergence of each of these countries, look at the way the partition took place in 1947, look at the way in which Bangladesh came into existence in 1971. So all of these factors have been defining regional politics. Not only that, all of these factors have also been playing a very important role in defining relations between countries. Colonial legacy, political borders have been hugely impacting the post-colonial relations between the countries. So when we think about the external factor and when we think about India's neighborhood, immediately after 1947, after getting independence, you can see it was not a very favorable kind of a situation in terms of its bilateral relations with the neighboring countries. So that defines that has a huge impact in terms of how India started looking towards its neighbor and how it started shaping its foreign policy. Similarly, when you think about external factors, we also need to take into consideration the global context and the existing global balance of power equations and how you are responding to the global balance of power equations or the global balance of power, global politics in general. So, and I'll be talking about it when we specifically talk about the initial phase of Indian foreign policy and the context in which India's foreign policy was shaped during the formative years after independence. Then the third factor, sometimes geography can also be considered as a part of the internal factors, but I'm trying to keep it as a separate factor because it has a huge impact in terms of defining the foreign policy of any country. So basically, when we talk about geography, we are looking at various dimensions of geography. So we are looking at territory. Sorry, we are looking at territory. We are looking at location. We are looking at the size of the country. We are looking at the topography, the kind of the kind of natural borders a country has, the territorial extent, whether the country is huge, whether it's a very small country. Say, for example, when you excuse me. So when we try to look at geography as one of the key determining factors in terms of defining the foreign policy of any country, so territory is very crucial, and more specifically when you try to look at various countries, for example, in South Asia, if we take the example of South Asia, you can look at South Asia, it's generally called as, is described as Indo-centric region. India being at the heart of South Asian region, having huge territory, has impacted a lot in terms of defining the threat perceptions of smaller state. Similarly, the way India looks at the smaller state. So when we think about geography, all of these factors, including territory, its location, its size, India for that matter, is located very strategically in terms of its location. It has huge, huge coastline. You look at the northern part of India, the northern border, which we, um, excuse me, okay, really sorry for that. I'm having some issues with my throat. So,
It's okay, sir.
if we look at India's natural geography, or if you look at more specifically, if you look at the physical map of India, you see that India is endowed with natural borders. You look at the northern part of India and the Great Himalayas. You look at the southern part of India, the Indian Ocean and the water bodies that have been providing a sort of a protective shield to India, and huge coastline. It also extends lots of opportunities to India. So whenever we are thinking about geography as one of the key determinants of foreign policy, all of these factors play a very important role. Similarly, when we think about one of the other factors, the fourth factor or the fourth determinant of Indian foreign policy can be seen in terms of its capabilities and global standing. Now, when we're talking about capabilities, we can talk about the economy, we can talk about the polity of a country, economy in terms of maybe the economic cloud that a country has, polity in terms of how stable a political system is in a given country. That plays a very crucial role in defining the foreign policy of a country. If it's a democratic country, if if it's a vibrant democracy, then you can expect a completely different kind of foreign policy than you might see in a sort of an authoritarian regime. So capabilities, when we think about, we are essentially talking about the political, economic capabilities, and at the same time, the image of a country, which gives some sort of legitimacy to a country in terms of shaping its relations, bilateral relations, multilateral relations, and which ultimately results in its global standing. So when we think about the key determinants of foreign policy, I think broadly these can be the factors that that one can pay attention to. And whenever we are thinking about India's foreign policy in terms of its trajectory throughout various phases, we can apply, we can look at it through these factors, which should give us an idea about how India's foreign policy looks at. Secondly, when we are looking at the principles of Indian foreign policy, then there could be multiple ways in which we can identify the core principles of Indian foreign policy. And so what I'm trying to do is to highlight the four key principles of Indian foreign policy. First, what can be called as anti-imperialism, and which obviously is the product of the culmination of the thought that evolved over a period of time throughout its freedom struggle, even after independence. So that played a very important role in providing a sort of a sound philosophical foundation for Indian foreign policy. Non-violence, which is deeply rooted in its cultural or historical lineage, we can trace back its roots to the religious philosophies, Hinduism, Buddhism, or even to to Gandhian ideas and the way it contributed to Indian foreign policy. Tolerance, self-determination, are the key principles that are very much there, that are the core elements of Indian foreign policy. So when we think about continuity and change, so there are two important things that we are trying to look at. First thing is that we are trying to look at the determinants that directly impact the foreign policy making in different phases. But at the same time, when we are talking about the key principles uh, that provide sort of a guidelines or sort of philosophical foundation to the foreign policy of a country, more or less these elements remain or provide a sort of a consistency to to foreign policy making. So these are the two things that if we try to look at, and in this particular context, if we try to understand India's trajectory immediately after independence and how it evolved over a period of time, and how we can look at it when we are looking at the contemporary phase of Indian foreign policy. But before going to talk about the phases or the sort of a trajectory, in fact, the way we are trying to look at it, let me also try to give you a perspective which also help us in understanding the very process of foreign policy making. Because generally, when we think about foreign policy, what we try to do is to understand the determinants and how these key determinants impact foreign policy making. At the most, we try to look at the philosophical foundations and the principles of a foreign policy. And on the basis of that, we try to analyze the foreign policy and we try to understand that why a particular country opted for a particular course of action in a given phase of a time. But if we try to look at it more specifically in terms of theory or rather some sort of models, then we can pay attention to what is called as foreign policy decision making. And there's a very interesting book by Mintz and de Ron, which actually talks about this element of foreign policy making. And if we try to look at it from that perspective, we also try to get a new angle in terms of understanding the foreign policy making and how it is impacted by different factors. So when we think about foreign policy decision making, we are actually talking about the process, the way countries trying to responding to a particular situation, and the way the actual process starts taking place. And then we are referring to various actors that are part of foreign policy making. These are individuals, these are groups, these are coalitions that play a crucial role in shaping the foreign policy, or that other part of the making, the making of the foreign policy. So foreign policy decisions, as we are aware, are characterized by high stakes, and there's a lot of uncertainty and substantial risk as well. Because the moment you are trying to respond to a particular situation, you have to anticipate the consequences based on the stakes that are involved, and that is how you are trying to respond to it. But then how your responses are shaped to a particular situation. And if we try to look at the models of foreign policy decision making more specifically, the two prominent models that the two authors are talking about in this particular book. The title of the book is Understanding Foreign Policy Decision Making. You can see the details of the book as well at the bottom of the slide. So it talks about two prominent models when it comes to foreign policy decision making. So there's something called as rational school, and then there is something called as cognitive school. When we are looking at the rational school, and according to many foreign policy decision making analysts, it looks at the state as rational actors, and the rational actor assumptions more specifically, that is very close to the realist understanding of international relations. particularly in terms of treating states as the key actors, believing that they are rational actors, and looking at their intent, which is to maximize gains and minimize losses. So basically, when we are trying to look at a rational school model, we are looking at a model which emphasizes a lot on essentially the way the states essentially respond to the external world or any situation, um, the way realism tells us, utilizing rationality and intending to maximizing their gains and minimizing the losses. This perspective in general is considered as a sort of an ideal perspective, because despite the fact that there's a lot of idealism that is there when it comes to foreign policy making, but somewhere at the end of the day, one of the most important aspect of foreign policy making is to ensure the protection of national interest. And generally, when we think about realist perspective in terms of understanding state actions and state behavior, more specifically in the context of anarchic international structure, we can see how state act rationally. They calculate, they try to analyze the situation, calculate the stakes that make calculations, and in that sense try to ensure that they are protecting their national interest. So in that sense, this apparently seemed to be a sort of an ideal type of a model when we try to look at foreign policy decision making. On the other hand, when we think about what is called as cognitive school, which has its root in psychology, and which actually helps us in understanding the importance of perception when it comes to foreign policy making. So basically, cognitive consistence means that decision makers downplay certain information that is inconsistent with prior images and belief. So in short, when we are thinking about the cognitive school, when it comes to foreign policy decision making, we're trying to understand the existing belief system of the policymakers or the actors that are involved into policy making, and how it hugely impacts foreign policy making. So when we in detail try to look at cognitive school, there are a number of aspects that are taken into consideration. There's something called as evoked state, which highlights what is called as immediate concern. For example, if there's an immediate issue that a country has to respond to, that time probably foreign policy makers don't have that much time to analyze the or anticipate the consequences. They just need to respond it immediately. At the same time, while responding to any such situation, urgent situation, probably your mind is distracted, or rather, not distracted, is very much focused on dealing with a particular issue at the hand. And that is how you may not necessarily be able to evaluate the situation in detail as such. So that's something which is called as evoked state. Then emotion in general play a very important role in foreign policy making. Public opinion also plays a crucial role in impacting foreign policy making and shaping the overall foreign policy of a country. Image is something where we are talking about how a state or how a country looks at world image. But there are certain images that are there. Images in this particular context act sort of a stereotype, the kind of imagery that we have about the external world, probably, or sometimes even about certain states. So that also has a huge impact in terms of how policy making takes place. And then there's something called as belief system and schema, which actually provides the basic foundation for making decisions on the basis of your existing beliefs and how you are interpreting it, how you understand it, and accordingly how you are responding to it. So the basic difference between what we call rational school and cognitive school is, on the one hand, where rational school gives us an idea about how rationality or rational behavior of state actors is crucial in terms of decision making. On the other hand, cognitive school emphasizes a lot the psychological aspect of decision making. So there's not a single factor which help us in understanding how foreign policy is made. So it's not just the determinants that we need to pay attention to when we are analyzing the foreign policy of any country. Neither only principles that are crucial. We also need to understand various other dimensions of the very process of foreign policy making. And this is just to give you sort of an idea that that there are a lot of complexities when it comes to foreign policy making. So it's not that simple that when we talk about foreign policy and when we try to critically evaluate the foreign policy, we need to understand the context, we need to understand the determinants, we need to understand how the very process, policy making process, is carried out in response to the existing realities. So on that background, when we try to understand the historical evolution of India's foreign policy, broadly we can divide the evolution of Indian foreign policy into four categories, or four phases rather. And this is not the typical categorization of phases, and there are various scholars, probably they have their own way to understand the evolution of Indian foreign policy throughout different phases of history. Um, Unfortunately, given the time constraint, we won't be able to look at each of these phases in detail. So I'll just quickly try to talk about the initial phase, and then probably we'll talk about the contemporary challenges or the present world, and how India looks at the contemporary challenges, or rather what are the contemporary challenges, and how we can think about India's foreign policy in present context. So the initial phase, when the four phases, that the way I'm trying to look at Indian foreign policy, the way it evolved over a period of time, as a response to the existing realities, and as a consequence of the various determinants, the way they impacted the making of Indian foreign policy. So generally, the first phase of Indian foreign policy, or the formative years, which begins in 1947 with the independence, till 1962, that entire phase, as all of us are aware, is dominated by the first prime minister, who was the prime minister and also kept the foreign ministry with himself. So the initial phase of Indian foreign policy has a huge impact of Nehruvian ideas. But when we are saying Nehruvian ideas, we can't also undermine the importance and the impact that the entire freedom struggle had, the Gandhian ideas had on Nehruvian policy, and the overall philosophical foundation that we refer to as a part of a determinant in terms of shaping Nehru's foreign policy and his own understanding of of India, as well as the external world. Second phase, somewhere when we look at 1962 to 1991, can be called as a phase where there is an overt pragmatism. Generally, when we think about Nehruvian foreign policy, uh, there are a lot of scholars, those who try to talk about Nehruvian foreign policy more specifically in the context of idealism. And in fact, there has been a critique it was excessively idealist sort of a foreign policy. But then there are contestations as well. Uh, but if you look at the second phase, more specifically after Nehruvian era, you'll see that there is a very overt pragmatism, which is very much visible in terms of let's look at Indira doctrine, or look at the way India was trying to respond to various situations. 1971. Look at nuclearization of India. So, in that sense, when we think about the second phase of Indian foreign policy, we can use term over pragmatism. Third phase actually is something which shaped uh, India's trajectory in a completely different manner, and we are referring to the economic trajectory more specifically, and that is the reason why it can also be considered as one of the uh, one of the phases of history where we are looking at a completely different direction, more specifically economic direction. And then the fourth phase is the present phase. So broadly, when we think about the historical evolution of India's foreign policy, I think these are the four broad phases that we can identify. Now, when we think about the initial phase, Nehruvian non-alignment phase, there were two important aspects of Nehruvian foreign policy. And as I just mentioned, that idealism was something which was one of the important characteristic. But having said that, it also doesn't mean that there was complete lack of pragmatism or realism as such. Uh, um, for example, when we use term non-alignment, and there's a lot of contestation about non-alignment as well, but in general, there's also an acceptance that non-alignment can also be seen as a very strategic policy, which was meant to respond to the existing realities of the Cold War politics. And perhaps non-alignment can be seen as the best strategy for India at that particular point of time to for ensuring the protection of its national interest. We are talking about the India in 1947, India that had just got independence, India that has seen partition, India that has already experienced colonialism, colonial exploitation, India which was still struggling with its economy, uh, India which was still trying to decide its developmental trajectory. So we are talking about very nascent phase of India's independence. We are talking about the initial phase where, on the one hand, you had to ensure that your national interests are protected, but at the same time, you also had to ensure that you are going to move in a direction which is leading you towards rather a sort of a major role. So that role conception was also very much important in terms of looking at the Nehruvian foreign policy in the initial phase. Panchashil played a very important role, not only providing a sort of a sound philosophical foundation to India's foreign policy, but also to the rest of the countries as well. You look at the Bandung conference, and then onwards, the way the term Panchashil itself has started gaining acceptance in Afro-Asian countries. India itself was very much keen on strengthening cooperation among Afro-Asian countries. So Panchashil, in that sense, gives us a very clear idea about the kind of foreign policy India was envisioning for itself. So it was a sort of a roadmap that is very much visible when we look at the Panchashil agreement. Uh, uh, the way it evolved from India-China agreement, and ultimately it became one of the essential part or one of the core elements of India's foreign policy. So if we look at the initial phase, which we can call as Nehruvian phase, non-alignment and Panchashil can be seen as the two important aspect of Indian foreign policy. And despite the fact that there's a lot of dominance of idealism, pragmatism has always been there, inherent in India's foreign policy decision making. Now, how to understand the element of pragmatism that has always been there in Indian foreign policy. So to understand that, to understand that element, let us try to understand certain key characteristics of India's foreign policy, and more specifically in the post-colonial era. So if you try to look at India's foreign policy, nowadays the term what is called as strategic autonomy is widely used in present times in terms of defining India's foreign policy or defining India's foreign policy decisions. But if you look at non-alignment itself, can be seen as an example of strategic autonomy, because there's a context in which we are talking about non-alignment. It's a Cold War context that we are referring to, when the world is divided into two blocks, and India, despite being a newly independent country, was daring to say, both the superpowers, that we don't want to join either of the blocks and we want to define our own path. And that is something which is very close to what we call strategic autonomy, a sort of an independence that a country needs to have when it is defining its foreign policy. Similarly, there is something called as strategic restraint, which has also been a crucial part of Indian foreign policy making. And when we are referring to what is called a strategic restraint, is something which is reflected in terms of India's hesitance in terms of applying hard power or trying to be more assertive or aggressive. And that's very much visible in terms of looking at India's bilateral relations and India's hesitance, or even you look at India's nuclear policy. We talk about no first use. So that gives us some sort of idea about a kind of a strategic restraint that has been there, which always tried to define the borders, or which always tried to define the limits for Indian foreign policy making actors or elites. Then self-determination is something which can be seen as the consequence of India's history, colonial experiences, and that played a very important role in the idea of self-determination and India's emphasis on the idea of self-determination. Similarly, self-reliance is something when we think about Indian foreign policy, right from the beginning or even in present times, reliance in terms of ensuring the development of a country without depending on any external actors. And that is the reason when you look at the initial phase of India's foreign policy, its economic policies, domestic economy, it tried to focus a lot on strengthening India from within, strengthening its economy. So these can be seen as the key characteristic, and there's an element of consistency throughout all of these phases when we specifically look at all of these characteristics, including strategic autonomy, strategic restraint. Obviously, in present times, apparently, we have started experiencing or witnessing some sort of challenges to what is called as strategic restraint. And it seems that Indian foreign policy has started changing its stance, more specifically when it comes to what is called as strategic restraint. But otherwise, you look at self-determination, self-reliance. They are still very much there in terms of understanding India's foreign policy. As I mentioned, when we try to understand the foreign policy of a country, we have to look at the context in which the foreign policy is made. We looked at the determinants, and when we talk about the context, you look at the initial phase of foreign policy. So the global context, it was the Cold War context. You look at the region, it was a post-colonial South Asia. It's a post-colonial, post-partition context, which was going to shape India's policy towards the region and towards the external world as well. You look at the domestic priorities. Domestic context also plays a very important role in defining the foreign policy of a country. So immediately after 1947, when India got independence, it had to look at it had to pay attention to the domestic priorities. And the domestic priorities, not only in terms of the economic priorities, you look at the socio-cultural fabric of a country, the way um, the integration of princely states take place, the concerns related to unity and integrity of India, the demand for linguistic state reorganizations, all of those were factors that India had to pay attention to. And that is the reason why domestic priorities also played a very important role, or rather impacting India's foreign policy in a particular context and trying to avoid getting unnecessarily entangled into the bipolar world, bipolar Cold War politics, which was dominating the entire global politics. So you look at the post-Cold War, post-World War II world, there were factors that have hugely impacted India's foreign policy. The Cold War, obviously, we talked about it. The changing global economic architecture, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the way both United States and Soviet Union were trying to promote and propagate capitalist and communist ideologies. United Nations, which was indicating a sort of a ray of hope for the newly independent countries in the form of promoting multilateralism. European Union can also be seen as an example, although it wasn't European Union at that time initially in 1952. It was the European Coal and Steel Community, but it gives us an idea about the increasing significance of peace and cooperation in Europe, and which was ultimately resulting into regional cooperation in Europe, and many other regions in the world in later part started to emulate that example. So this is the context which shaped India's initial foreign policy, or the foreign policy throughout the initial phase. Now, as I can see, there's almost 8 past 5 minutes, so I think we don't have much time. But I'll quickly give you the context, the present context. And when we look at the present context and when we try to understand India's foreign policy, probably the way we looked at the initial phase of India's foreign policy, how the global context, regional context, domestic context played a very important role in defining India's foreign policy. Similarly, when we think about contemporary world and when we try to understand India's foreign policy in present times, then we need to understand the context in which India is defining its foreign policy in present times. So if you look at the systemic level, if you look at the contemporary world in general, so there are certain characteristics of contemporary world. There's a term which is widely being used, even debated, emerging world order. The people, the scholars, those who have already started talking about new world order, but then we can use term emerging world order because the term is still contested. And when we talk about emerging world order, we are talking about the way world has started, the US dominated order is being changed, is being challenged, and how it is leading to a completely new world order perhaps. Secondly, changing geopolitics and geoeconomics. When we are referring to changing geopolitics and geoeconomics, actually all of these things are interrelated somewhere. So when we are talking about emerging world order and when we are talking about changing geopolitics and geoeconomics, we're also talking about the global power shift from west to east, the rise of Asia, rise of China, um, rise of powers like India, China, Brazil, etc. So there are new centers of power, and the emergence of new centers of power have not only started impacting the existing global balance of power equations, but also started challenging the existing order, which was very West-centric order, and that is a very key factor in terms of defining the foreign policies of most of the countries in present times. Geoeconomics has also started gaining momentum. The term geopolitics apparently seem to be very dominant when we study international relations. But in post 90s international relations literature, you see that the term geoeconomies economics has started gaining momentum, which talks about the intersections of economics, politics, and security, and which gives us a very market-centric, economic-centric analysis of the political underpinnings in contemporary worlds. Then emerging technology, the rise of the digital space, cybersecurity, AI have hugely started impacting the global politics. And that's one of the key concerns, or rather, that is one of the key factors that is going to play a very dominant role in defining, in general, the policies of countries and foreign policies in particular. Similarly, when you look at the very idea of security, you look at the post 90s conceptualization of security, which started incorporating multiple reference, including human security, climate security, individual security, etc., has already widened the purview of the term security. And when we look at the contemporary security challenges to the countries, so it's not just the hard power politics which countries are paying attention to. It's energy, it's climate, it's transnational organized crime, terrorism, trade routes, etc. So all of these factors have started emerging, or started gathering momentum, and consequently started impacting the foreign policy of a country. So in present context, when we think about India's foreign policy, each of these factors have started impacting India's foreign policy. And if we look at India's foreign policy in present times, we talked about certain characteristics: strategic autonomy, strategic restraint, self-determination, self-reliance. Most of these principles are still very much there, but when you are trying to respond to the changing world order, you need to make changes in terms of how you're responding to each of the changes that you start experiencing around you, in your neighborhood, at external world. And those changes have been shaping India's foreign policy. So initially, when we talked about non-alignment, throughout 1947 to 62, later there was a sort of overt pragmatism. Post 90s, you'll see how economy started gaining importance. Non-alignment was a term which was being looked at being much more redundant, in although there are contestations when it comes to the relevance of non-alignment, but the term that is used in present, or rather in contemporary foreign policy discussion, is what is called as multi-alignment. And then there's a difference when we try to look at what is non-alignment and how we differentiate it from multi-alignment. So multi-alignment in that sense is a sort of an active policy, active in the sense that it seeks alignment. When we talked about non-alignment, there was a specific context. There was a Cold War context. There was ideological context, which played a crucial role. Although non-alignment wasn't neutrality as such, but then it was different than what we talk about in present times when the term multi-alignment is being used. So basically, when we look at India's foreign policy, and more specifically when we are using term strategic trajectories, although strategic trajectories can be seen in the form of responses and systematic responses. So the term strategic is used in that sense, that we are looking at the way India's foreign policy was responding to the changing circumstances, and how it was systematically, and in that sense, logically trying to respond to the changing circumstances. But nowadays, there's also another discussion, which is a part of the overall foreign policy discourse, which tries to understand the strategic culture of India. Although we are not going to get into the strategic culture of India, but just to make a reference to that, and there's a debate. There has been a debate about whether India has a strategic culture or not. And then the scholars, those who suggest that India that way doesn't have a strong strategic culture as such. George Tanhan, for example, is a major name who put forth that argument. But on the contrary, there are scholars, those who are trying to look at the history, look at the kind of cultural legacy that India has, and the kind of strategic thinking evolved over a period of time. But that's not the part of the discussion. So finally, when we try to understand India's foreign policy, along with the key determinants, along with the principles, we also need to take into consideration various perspectives as we looked at in terms of foreign policy making models. Also, we need to take into consideration the context, which plays a very important role in defining the foreign policy of a country. But at the same time, we can also pay attention to what is called as strategic culture. So in conclusion, what I would like to suggest is that when we try to look at India's foreign policy, it has evolved over a period of time, and it's not unique about India. So it's the general characteristic of a foreign policy. It evolves over a period of time, but still, um, although we say that it evolved over a period of time, there's an element of consistency. There's a solid philosophical foundation, and which has been playing a very important role in projecting India's image at at the global level. So each of these factors have been playing a very important role in defining India's foreign policy throughout these phases. And if we try to understand India's foreign policy in present context, along with all these factors, determinants, we also need to understand the context, present context, and how India needs to respond to the present context. So I think this was something which I was thinking to talk about. In fact, there were lots of things which I was initially thinking to talk about, but then I realized that it's not that easy to look at each of these dimensions in detail. So just had to make passing references to most of the points that I was initially thinking to discuss in detail. But I think a sort of a broader framework which I thought that I should provide kind of a templates that you can use when we try to understand the foreign policy and the more specifically the foreign policy making and how the foreign policy of a country evolves or is shaped or is determined. So that's how I try to look at it. So I'll stop here and I'll thank you all again for listening to me. If you have any questions, you're most welcome.
Thank you, sir, for insightful words. With that, we open the floor for questions. Participants who are inquiring to ask questions, I request to raise your hands. Madhumita Dutta, you can begin.
Hello, sir. Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Good evening.
Okay, sir. Sir, I'm Wing Commander Madhumita, and presently I'm doing my PhD from Pondicherry University, and I'm working in Indian Air Force. So, sir, I wanted to ask you that whatever determinant that you discussed about in the contemporary era, will space also be one of the key determinant in present era, because we have seen a lot of budget go into MOD, and that same budget has been allocated to space, and we are moving through space based weapons, and we are moving the astronauts to the Gaganyaan mission and various others. So space, do you think will be one of the key determinants in Indian foreign policy in the contemporary era? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. So, should I respond, or should we just wait for other questions? Or
So you can respond.
okay, I think space. When we talk about the key determinants of Indian foreign policy, and when I try to highlight the major determinants that have been impacting the foreign policy of a country, in present times, obviously, space has started acquiring a tremendous importance when we think about foreign policy. Because in present times, what we have started experiencing, witnessing, is that the very nature of warfare has also started changing. Partly because of the technological revolution, uh, 4.0, what it is being called as, the increasing importance of cyberspace, digital space, digital technology. So new domains of confrontations are also emerging. And I think space is one such domain that's a sort of an emerging domain where we can see future contestations as well. So yes, it's a very important factor that is going to hugely impact the foreign policies of a country in near future.
Right, sir. Thank you, sir.
Participants willing to ask questions may raise their hands. Purvi, you can go on.
Yes, my question is, so can you elaborate a bit more on policy of multi-alignment? Because then, if we are going for multi-alignment, then is non-alignment completely irrelevant? And also, when we talk about multi-alignment, then how is India viewing itself in world affairs? Because non-alignment brought us closer to the third world. So, are we now off with viewing us as the third world, and have we gone about to view us as a part of some other, viewing us as something different? So, can you please elaborate more on that policy?
Okay, so two things. Thanks, Purvi, for that question. Two things. One is when we are talking about multi-alignment, does it also means that non-alignment has become irrelevant in present times? So probably if I address that particular question, that part of the question first, is that I personally have been looking at non-alignment as a policy which is very close to what we call strategic autonomy. And in that sense, if you look at, obviously, because one of the major reasons why non-alignment is being considered as rather redundant in present times is primarily because of the context in which it evolved, the Cold War context, and it was in a way also partly a response to the ideological confrontation which was taking place. So India, in that sense, was trying to remain non-aligned. So although it wasn't neutrality, somewhere there was an element of it was relatively passive in that sense. So if you compare it with multi-alignment, apparently when we think about present multi-alignment, it seems that it's more proactive kind of a policy. So if we have to differentiate between non-alignment and multi-alignment, one major difference is in terms of the context that these two policies are being talked about. The first one is the Cold War context, and now we are talking about the present context, where and it also has to do with India's role and capabilities. Because if you remember, when I was referring to the determinant aspect, one of the key determinants is the capabilities of a country and its global standing. So you go back to the Cold War phase, and that time you look at India's capabilities and its role, probably the way it could impact impact international relations, or the way it could engage itself with the rest of the world. Not that it did not. Nehruvian policy in that sense was very much a policy which was trying to project India, at least as a sort of a regional leader, or a country that is very much keen on strengthening a sort of Afro-Asian alliances, something like that. But then still there was some sort of what we can say, a sort of a baggage, Cold War baggage, which is generally associated with the idea of non-alignment. And probably that could be one of the factors where we can make the difference between non-alignment and multi-alignment. And in that sense, multi-alignment apparently also seems to be more proactive, in the sense the way we are trying to respond to the changing situation. We talked about the global changing global balance of power equations and the need to strengthen relations with emerging powers, emerging blocs. So India being part of Quad, simultaneously being part of SCO, simultaneously being part of BRICS. This gives us an idea about the kind of engagement that India is seeking in present times as a result to the changing circumstances. So probably these could be the factors that that we can take into consideration when we are actually trying to make a difference between non-alignment and multi-alignment. And in fact, I think a few years back, there was an initiative and there was an idea called non-alignment 2.0, which also was a part to readdress non-alignment in present times, probably. So talking about the relevance of non-alignment, probably there could be a debate about that, and there could be different perspectives. But it's also true that we are also talking about multi-alignment, and that is one of the defining characteristics if you look at India's contemporary foreign policy. I don't know to what extent I could answer your question, but that is how I thought that I should respond to it.
Thank you, sir. Raise of hands for questions. Okay, we'll have the last question for today. Madhumita, you can go on.
Yeah, sir, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Sir, in this context, which you just mentioned, that India is looking towards more of multi-alignment. So my question is multi-alignment taking us away from the neighborhood? Because we thought in 1971, we have helped Bangladesh to be an independent nation, whereas the way history was projected, the boons of contention was planted then only. And what we see today, that in India's neighborhood, India is not so much engaged, or India is misunderstood, or India is failing. Whereas when we see globally, India is the leader of global south. So don't you think it's very contradictory?
Uh, that's again a very interesting thing to look at it. Two things. One is when we are trying to suggest that when we are opting for multi-alignment, does it mean that we are neglecting the neighborhood? See, neighborhood has been something which has been which has always been one of the critical factors in defining India's foreign policy right from the beginning. As we talked about it, there was a context in which each of these countries got independence. So that context definitely was there. But in present times, when we think about India's neighborhood, apparently there are lots of factors that have started compelling India to rather re-emphasize or draw its attention towards its neighbor. More specifically, as we just talked about it, the changing balance of power equations, etc. But more than that, the increasing influence of external actors in the region, be it United States, more specifically China, that has been raising alarms about how whether we are lagging behind in terms of engaging with neighbors. Are we not paying that much attention to the neighbors? Are we failing to strengthen our ties with our immediate neighbor? But we also need to keep in mind is that it's a very complex neighborhood that we have, and the relations between the countries have also been very complex, and there are multiple dimensions to the relations that are being shared by South Asian countries. Identity is also one of the important factors, shared history, culture, etc. So it's only after 1947 we started looking at each of these countries as separate political entities. So that further makes it very complex to look at this particular neighborhood. The problem is that India did started paying attention to the neighbors, but present context, as we just talked about it, is compelling more and more to engage with the neighbors, and that is also seen in the present policy making as well. So now we talk about neighborhood first policy. Not that we were not paying attention to the neighbors. You look at Indira Doctrine, you look at Gujarat Doctrine, but there was a perspective in terms of how you were looking at your neighbors. Partly, there's also critic in terms of India's approach towards neighborhood. Sometimes it was also said that India takes its neighbor for granted. So the point is how we need to look at our neighborhood in present context. And when I'm referring to the present context, more specifically, two things that I'm referring to: the changing domestic environment in India's neighborhood. That is one thing. And second important thing is increasing external influences, more specifically increasing Chinese influence in the region. And in that particular context, now we need to think about India's foreign policy and the way India needs to approach its neighborhood. I think that context we need to keep in mind.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. With that, we come to the end of the third lecture talk of MindSphere Talks hosted by JAIR. On behalf of Radha Association International Relations, I, Soham Das, sincerely express my greatest appreciation for your esteemed presence. And, sir, we look forward to having you in our future events as well. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants for joining in. We look forward to having you in our future sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Soham. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. You're free to leave.